Yes.
You got it there?
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Okay, so thank you for the introduction, Glenn. And today I'm going to be talking about the importance of peer observations. What I'm going to say hopefully should be just as applicable if you are in an online teaching environment as if you were back to face. We can always do Zoom peer observations, of course. So where did I get all these? Well, the idea of doing this presentation from? Well, I was reading something by Dan Lorty, who was an American educationalist back in the 70s especially, and he said something that was blindingly obvious, but because I'd never thought of it myself, I thought it was quite profound. He talked about the apprenticeship of observation. Basically, the idea here is that if you finish school, you go to university and you become, I don't know, a car mechanic or an airline pilot, you go into those careers basically with a blank slate. You don't have preconceived notions of what it really means to be those sort of jobs. Whereas if you become a teacher later in life, you have the whole of your educational life and experience behind you, and you have this kind of cargo cultish idea of what it means to be a teacher. You can just copy what you saw at school. Of course, that observation would have only given you a fraction of the story. Teachers themselves make a lot of decisions that are unknown to the students. So what can we do about this apprenticeship of observation? Well, one of the things that's very trendy at the moment is to lead our teachers towards becoming reflective practitioners. Now, the idea itself is not new. Dewey labeled it about 100 years ago, but it only really rose to prominence with Donald Schoen in the 1980s, then Kolb, and then Penny added her 2 cents worth, all of which led to this diagram that we have just here, the reflective practice workflow, however you might call it. For me, the reflective observation aspect that you see on the right here could have been at the top. It could be the start of becoming a reflective practitioner. This idea of critical observation leading into abstract conceptualization, where you start to think about the ideas behind what you've seen, then you experiment with those ideas, they give you some experience, and then you repeat this cycle pretty much forever. So what is then the goal of peer observation? I'm going to be referring to a work by Jill Koch that's about 20 years old several times during this talk. She introduces it very nicely. She talks about how in a reflective context, peer observation is not carried out in order to judge the teaching of others, but to encourage self-reflection and self-awareness about our own teaching. I think this is a very important point because a lot of schools have a dual track of observations. They have peer observations on the one hand, where teachers go into the classroom to observe another teacher, and they have the formal observation system on the other, which is evaluative. Usually the director of studies or an academic director, something like that, will observe teachers. The idea being to evaluate the performance, to see if they're going to stay at the school, what sort of work they need to do to progress their career. That doesn't really fit well into this idea of becoming a reflective practitioner. It's kind of too much of the feedback is on a plate to you. So the idea here is not to judge, but rather to help the observer grow as a teacher and to develop more. However, we can't just send our teachers in and tell them go and observe. That sort of thing probably won't work. We need to remember Noonan's adage that teaching is not equal to learning. I think this applies to teachers and teacher development just as much as it applies to what we do in the classroom regularly as teachers. We can't assume that teachers know how to peer observe. We can't assume that we can simply tell teachers how to peer observe. So I think that training here is crucial. And I think you could design either a workshop or a series of workshops around the idea of peer observations and what teachers can do to make the most of these opportunities. One way of doing that would be to have the very first peer observation of the school year take place either virtually or in an input session where you would talk about what it means to peer observe. You would develop a worksheet for one aspect of peer observations. Maybe you want to practice how to check how instructions are given, if they are worded clearly, if concept check questions are used, things like that. And then once the team's on board with this idea, play a video of somebody teaching. There are so many videos on YouTube set in the classroom that just show what teaching is like. Get the teachers to fill out these forms, get them talking afterwards about what they saw, and see if they saw the same sort of things, so that they can then progress into live peer observations. Okay, now in terms of the peer observations themselves, then Kosh describes 7 different methods. So her paper, although it's quite old, is well worth a read. There's going to be the full details in the last slide at the end. Of those 7, there are 3 that I found particularly interesting to consider. The first one is on the topic of pair mentoring. So in this case, you could get 2 teachers. Maybe they would both be novices straight off the CELTA. Maybe you would have a novice and a more experienced teacher. And maybe the first teacher would say, listen, I've got a bit of a problem with classroom management. My kids are misbehaving. Can you come and watch me a couple of times and give me some feedback? Can we talk about that? Then the other person will say, sure, but in exchange for that, could you come and make sure that I'm giving instructions clearly? So you get them working together and they try to help each other through those sort of observations. So I like that method. The next one would be the traditional idea that a teacher has a particular problem, maybe on giving feedback that's useful. So they go to observe a couple of different teachers so that they can experience different ways of delivering feedback. So that's a nice area. But probably the best one I found would be this idea that, again, you could lead into a workshop or a swap shop here. You think of an area of general interest, like the ones I've mentioned before. All of the teachers observe classes. So everybody gets involved in peer observation over the, I don't know, maybe a month, give them a 1 month window. They fill in the same observation task sheet. And then you have a swap shop workshop, an input session where everyone discusses the topic. What I like about this is that it really anonymizes the feedback. So instead of saying, oh, I saw Peter, he did this, which was really odd to me or something. Instead of that, everybody has seen other teachers. So they just say, oh, I saw this or I saw that. That way, everyone brings what they've seen and they share their ideas, taking it to the max. Okay, now I've talked a bit then about the observer's side. How important is it that the observer give feedback? Well, according to a paper by Hendry and Oliver from 2012, evidence is emerging that the process of observing is just as, if not more, valuable than being observed and given feedback. So does that mean that it doesn't matter? Does it mean that after the peer observation, you've observed the lesson, you've filled out the worksheet, great, well done, go on to do whatever, and you don't need to even say thank you to the teacher? I don't think so. I think that it's important to establish a dialogue, and this brings me back to Dan Lorty and this apprenticeship of observation. By having that dialogue between the observer and the observed teacher, they can start asking questions about rationale. Like, you did this in the class. I thought that was very interesting. Can you tell me why you did it so that I can kind of understand it more fully? And that way, we're not just second guessing what we've seen. We're basing our observations and then our ideas about that on something a little bit more concrete. So I think that observer feedback does have a role to play. However, there is a danger, of course, that observer feedback then becomes judgmental. The peer observer starts to think that they've become like the substitute DOS or something. They start to say, oh, I wouldn't have done it that way. So maybe training there would be necessary. Maybe an arbitrator would be necessary. That then leads me to think about the observer effect. Let's say that you have a problem with a particular student or set of students. They are unruly. You don't know how to manage them. So you ask somebody to come in and peer observe you. You don't really want the director of studies to come in and form a bad opinion of you. So your friend comes in, they watch, nothing's wrong. Bunch of angels. What are you talking about? Well, this is the observer effect. And Rag talked about it. He said that it has to be recognized when someone new comes into the classroom to observe, the presence of that additional adult will influence what happens. There are a couple of solutions. One of them is to record in video the whole lesson so that you can watch it at your liberty later. Doesn't really work very well because the sound quality might not be very good. You've got to think of camera angles. Second option would be to have the lesson online. so that the students don't even know that there's an observation happening. And the third, my favorite, would be to have repeat peer observations so that the kids in that case just forget about it. This happened with my young learners certificate that I did at IHBLSCO. The first time that the class was observed, the students were cowed into quietness. The second lesson, they forgot about it. They were right back on track being the way they were. So to bring me right to the end, then I want to link back to John Donne's statement that no man is an island entire of itself. We have to remember that we are a community of teachers. Peer observation is part of that community. Robert said something very clever about it just here, which you can read for yourselves. And I shall leave myself on this references page. So if anyone wants to check out where I got my ideas from, they are not my own. They're all here. Thank you.
Wow.